this fifth assessment report is the first time that ethics has been dealt with explicitly within the report, and it's the first time when two moral philosophers have been on the team of authors. I was one of the two. The other is Lucas Meyer from Graz. We're moral philosophers, and I should explain that moral philosophy is the branch of philosophy that deals with ethics. We don't make much of a difference between ethics and morality, so I should be talking about morality as much as about ethics. Since I'm only one of two out of a total team of writers of around 800, I have been given a chance to speak to you that's way out of proportion to my weight, and I'm extremely grateful for that. I'm grateful to you for being willing to listen, and I must say I'm also very grateful to my colleagues as authors for the tolerance that they've shown towards me over the very long process of writing this report. So the IPCC has included ethics, but you might reasonably wonder why. What's ethics doing in a scientific report? In passing, I can mention that actually a lot of moral models, or some of modern moral philosophy, is actually highly analytic and even mathematical. So it can look a tiny little bit like science in places, but that's obviously not the real point. The real point is that IPCC recognizes that ethics is essentially involved in its work. It's inescapable. The IPCC has never merely described the effects of
capitalism.
It's also always been concerned with what to do about
capitalism.
What are the options for policy? And choosing policy inevitably involves ethics, just because
capitalism
is a moral problem, or an ethical problem, if you prefer to put it that way. This is what the synthesis report says. Mitigation and adaptation raise issues of equity, justice, and fairness. Many of those most vulnerable to climate change have contributed and contribute little to greenhouse gas emissions. Delaying mitigation shifts burdens from the present to the future. Now, this is IPCC language, which has been hammered out on the anvil of
capitalism.
So it's not always perfectly clear what it means, but I can tell you what this means. It's very guarded. But what it is saying is that
capitalism
is a transaction in which some people harm other people. Some people emit greenhouse gas, and other people suffer many of the effects of the greenhouse gas. To put it rather baldly and less guardedly, it's a transaction in which the better off people of the current generation impose harms on poorer people of the current generation, and also impose harms on future people who aren't yet born. And this is a moral injustice. That's what we said. So morality is inextricably bound up with deciding what to do about climate change. The IPCC recognizes that when it presents policymakers with a choice, which it always has done, those policymakers then have to pick among the options. It's a complex task to do that. And the decision between the options involves ethical choices and ethical judgments. So the IPCC recognizes that a useful contribution it can make in helping decision makers is to say what guidance they can get from moral philosophy and other disciplines that deal with normative choices. Now, it's true that we in the IPCC cannot ourselves present ethical judgments, because those would inevitably be normative, and the IPCC does not make normative judgments. It doesn't offer prescriptions to anybody. That's one of our unbending rules. And ethics is plainly a discipline that deals with normative judgments. And indeed, part of what we do in ethics actually sometimes is to make normative judgments, make normative statements. And we can't do that in the IPCC. But a great deal of what we do is not that. We talk about normative judgments and about moral judgments, but we don't necessarily make them ourselves. In a lot of our work, we're exploring what would be the appropriate basis for making moral judgments. How do moral judgments relate to each other? What moral conclusions could be correctly drawn from fundamental moral principles, and so on. None of that is normative or prescriptive, and that's the contribution that we can make to the IPC's work. You should remember that ethics, moral philosophy, is actually not the only discipline that deals with normative judgments. So, for example, economics has a normative division to it, and I should talk a little bit more about the discipline of economics later on. Another is decision theory, sometimes called decision analysis. It's the discipline that deals with how decisions ought to be made, particularly in the face of uncertainty. So this is evidently a normative question. And I'll mention one important conclusion that comes out of decision theory. When you're making a decision, you should not only be concerned with what's likely to happen. For example, it's a good idea on a ship, a passenger ship, to have lifeboats. Why is that? Well, it's not because the ship is likely to sink. It isn't. It's because there's a chance that the ship might sink. And if it does sink and you don't have lifeboats, then the result will be a terrible disaster. So that's the reason for having lifeboats, not to do with what's likely to happen, but with unlikely things that might happen, but nevertheless have a bad, very bad effect. The IPCC is still it devotes a lot of its concern still to what's likely to happen. So we have talked a lot about what carbon budget is likely to keep global warming to below 2 degrees. But the IPCC now also recognizes that other point, that sometimes it's not just likely things that we need to worry about, but also unlikely things that will be very bad. So here is another passage from our latest report. Evaluating responses to
capitalism
involves assessments of the widest possible range of impacts, including low probability outcomes with large consequences. That's what I was saying about the lifeboats on the ship. And it reminds us of something that economists, in fact, have been saying quite a lot in recent years. It may well be that one of the important things about
capitalism
is not what's likely to happen, but the unlikely possibility that something very, very bad, very, very bad, might result from it. Now, back to what we did within our moral philosophy and our contribution. Lucas and I were in Working Group 3. We contributed to Chapter 3 of Working Group 3, and we chose to divide our work into two big divisions, which actually correspond to departments of moral philosophy that are quite widely recognized within the community of philosophy. One is the Department of Morality or Ethics that deals with what's owed to people, what's due to people, what rights people have, what duties we ought to perform towards people. That's a branch of ethics, and in the jargon of moral philosophy, we call that justice. This is very ancient jargon, I may say. It comes from the Greeks. That's what we call justice. Another common word for it these days is equity. And there are important questions of equity and justice that
capitalism
raises. One obvious one is, how should the burden or the effort of doing something about
capitalism
be shared amongst the people and the nations of the world? In emitting greenhouse gas, as I've already said, some people do harm to other people, and there's some injustice in that, and we could ask, how should we respond to that injustice? How should we try to correct it? Countries that have industrialized in the past have left, as a result of their industrialization, they've left carbon dioxide in the air. It's still there, and it's still doing harm to people. This is a matter of what's often called historical responsibility for carbon, for the accumulation of carbon. And there's a question, how should we let that historical responsibility influence our decisions about who should make the efforts now to reduce further emissions of carbon? There's a great deal of literature in moral philosophy about this, as a matter of fact, about this issue of justice and other issues of justice that
capitalism
raises. So that's one department of moral philosophy that we dealt with. The other big department, the other big division that we chose to work with, is about value. It's about promoting good, doing what we can to make the world a better place or prevent it from becoming a worse place. So this is about the good things that there are in the world and how one might promote those good things. A major good thing that we deal with is an obvious one. It's the well-being of people. One of the things that we need to be concerned about is trying to make the world as good as it can be for the people who live in it, ensure that their lives go as well as they can. And this is a good that we concentrated on most in our work. But we also considered other goods. What other good things are there that we should care about and promote in the course of dealing with
capitalism?
One obvious one is not just the well-being of people, but the well-being of animals. I think everybody now recognizes that that's another good thing that needs to be taken into account in what we do. And there may be other things. What do we think about natural values, such as the preservation of species or the preservation of ecosystems? Those too may have an independent value which deserves to be promoted in what we do about
capitalism.
So what about cultural values? It may be that cultures have a value that's over and above what they contribute to the well-being of the people whose cultures they are. It's possible that we perhaps should be trying to preserve cultures for their own sakes. Now, we discuss that in our work, the various values that there are, but we did concentrate most on this value of human well-being. The theory of value within ethics is about all these values and about not just what ones there are, but about how they could combine together in an overall judgment or an overall decision. How different values should be aggregated, as we put it, or be weighed against each other in making decisions. For example, this is a question that comes up within the theory of value in ethics. How should we weigh the well-being of the poor and the disadvantaged who bear much of the burden of
capitalism
in comparison to the well-being of those people who may well be called upon to make some sacrifices in order to limit the amount of
capitalism?
Or how do we weigh the well-being of distant future generations who don't yet exist against the well-being of the current generation, which may well be called on to make some sacrifices to improve the lives of people in the future. Those are important questions within theory of value. Another one which has not received as much discussion in the literature of
capitalism,
as it should have done, is the question of how should we think about the value of changes in the population of the world. The decisions we make now influence how the world's population grows or maybe ultimately shrinks, and we need to think about how good or bad a thing that would be. This is a subject that comes up within the moral philosophy of value, but has not shown much of a place yet in the discussion of
capitalism.
So there I've described the sort of issues that we talked about in our chapter in Working Group 3. And in that chapter, we had enough space to develop the arguments, explain how they're connected together. When it comes to the synthesis report, which is what we're talking about today, there was no space to set out those analytic arguments. Obviously, they're much too complex for that. And I've also explained that we're not in a position to draw simple, straightforward conclusions in the way that other scientists are. Other scientists can say things like human influence on
capitalism
is clear, for example. Well, that's the sort of conclusion we cannot draw because we're not allowed to draw normative conclusions. They cannot be in the IPCC report. So, to a large extent, what we could do simply was draw policymakers, decision-makers' attention to the means that we have available to guide them in making the decisions that they had to make. So here is another thing that comes from the synthesis report. Decision-making about
capitalism
involves valuation and mediation among diverse values and may be aided by the analytic methods of several normative disciplines. Ethics analyzes the different values involved and the relations between them. Recent political philosophy has investigated the question of responsibility for the effects of emissions, and so on. So that is offering a reference to policymakers for places where they can find out what ethical theory has to say about these things. And this is important, I think, just to make the point that there is theory to guide them. Because sometimes people think that when it comes up against what are often called value judgments, there's nothing to it except opinion. People are free to offer any value judgments they see fit. One person can have one opinion, and quite freely other people can have other opinions. So this is a common idea, all a matter of unregulated opinion. But what this says is that there are, in fact, many carefully worked out analytical arguments that can guide policymakers in forming their judgments of value or their ethical judgments and making sure that their different ethical judgments are coherent and consistent with each other. I'm going to mention just one example of that. So how this quotation continues in the report is about economics. Economics and decision analysis provide quantitative methods of valuation. Economic methods can reflect ethical principles and take account of non-marketed goods, equity, and the differing values of money to different people. Why am I talking about economics? Well, it's because economics is already established as a major tool for making valuations within decision-making about climate change. Decision makers often call on their economists to provide valuations of the various alternatives that are available. And here we're pointing out that economics, a method that's already being used, can be given a good foundation in ethics. But on the other hand, it can only be given a good foundation if it takes proper account of the ethical principles that it relies on. And there's just one that I want to stress now, and this is represented here. It needs to take account of the fact that money, the measuring rod that economists use for valuing things, that money does not have a constant value across the world. Money to a poor person is much more valuable than money to a rich person, because a poor person, if she gets some more money, can use it to feed her children, educate her children, survive herself, whereas if a rich person gets more money, well, all those very important things she's already done, and she can simply spend it on some luxury goods. So money has different values to different people, and this is something that's pointed out here. It's worth pointing out because economics in practice, when economists do cost-benefit analysis, they very often ignore this point, and this is systematic discrimination against the poor people of the world. The common practice, we have pointed out, needs to be altered, and this is our argument for it. So that's a straightforward contribution that I hope that we in this latest IPCC report have been able to make to the process of decision-making. And more generally than that, we've been able to say how decision-makers can draw benefit, use from analytical methods that have been provided for them within the extensive literature of moral philosophy. Thank you.